Hey folks, it's B Mays here. Today we're going to be building the Armattan VTail quadcopter. This is the 355 version. Chris also has a 258 VTail. We are definitely going to be inverting our rear motor. When you order your DIY kit, it's going to include everything that you need to assemble your model. This particular kit includes the mullet flight controller and the 1800 kV house motors. The 355 will use 8-inch props. Chris is including gym fan props with all of the DIY kits. Let's get started. When you receive your VTail kit, your top and bottom plates are going to come pre-assembled, the same as they would for the tricopter kit. The mounting screws for the power distribution board are already installed. We're going to go ahead and install the motors onto the arms first, the same as we've done with all of the other builds. Let me just show you why I install the motors first before actually assembling the frame. If we look at the arms the way that I have these oriented right now, we can see that the holes that are furthest apart, right here and here, here and here, those are opposite of each other right now, and we don't want that. When we mount these arms to our frame, we want everything to be the same. So if we install these arms onto the frame and then go to install our motors, we may find that one of these arms is installed upside down as to how we need it. So if we install the motors first, we don't have to worry about that. They've included a packaging list that shows all of our screws, flight control that you've ordered, whether you've gotten the XT60 or the T-Deans, everything that's included in your kit. Just going to open up our motor. We won't be using the motor adapter. We're going to set the prop adapter off to the side. So all we need at the moment is the motor. Now we want to orient the motor so that our wires are going down the center of the arm. And you want to look at your arm and make sure that your screw holes are lined up in the back like we just talked about. And they are. So we're going to go ahead and fasten this one down. This pack is labeled motor screws. So we're going to go ahead and open that up. We want to put a little bit of Loctite on the threads of each screw. So we've got just a little drop of Loctite on there. We're going to go ahead and fasten this down. I'm not going to tighten any of them up just yet till we get them all in. So we're just going to repeat this process for all 4 arms. So we have the motors installed on all 4 arms. The next thing we need to do is install the arms onto the top and bottom plate. The longer arms will be mounted to the front. These shorter arms will be mounted on the rear. So we're just going to use our pack here. It's labeled arms. Slide the arm in between the plates. And install the 2 nylock nuts. Okay. Now, we have our third arm here. This one doesn't get a motor. This third arm just mounts in here right like this. That's what's going to create the rear of our VTail. There's no need to put any Loctite or anything on these because these are nylock nuts, so they're gonna stay pretty good. Now, this is what creates our VTail. This is going to mount underneath, right here like this. We have our package that says tail. All of these holes in here are threaded. So we are going to want to put just a tiny drop of Loctite on each one of these. And we're going to mount our tail assembly. Now we're going to mount our rear arms on top of here, right like this. And our motors, we're going to be building this with the rear motors inverted. So we're going to want to flip that upside down and mount it right like that. Do the same thing on the other side. Now's a good time for us to go ahead and install our landing gear. One is going to mount right here. And what I do is just put it through there. Just put a tiny drop of Loctite on the threads. Just screw that down right there. The other one goes here. Tiny drop. You definitely want to put a little Loctite on these, because I've had mine, I forgot to do it, and I had my landing gear actually vibrate loose. Then we can install our rubber feet onto here right like this. I'm not going to do that just yet. So there it is. All we need to do is go back and tighten these up. Tighten, make sure everything's good here. Don't want to over tighten because we got Loctite on there, but make sure they're good and snug. Alright, now you should have your frame fully assembled. Should look exactly like this. You can see where the rear motors are at an angle. What that's going to offer is not only just the cool factor, but it offers better yaw authority. It does, however, reduce your flight times. Our rear motors are not as efficient as they would be because they're at an angle, so they're pushing air this way rather than pushing air straight down. But it sure does look cool. Now we're ready to go ahead and mount our power distribution board. In the pack here with our power distribution board, we have the distribution board. In my case, I'm using the XT60 battery connector. He's included the bullet connectors, the power wire, solder that we need to solder everything up, and he's included the heat shrink tubing right here that we're going to use for the bullet connectors. The reason that we're using the bullet connectors is our ESC, I don't know if you can see on this picture that I have here, but the ESC configuration in the rear is going to be a little bit different than it would be for our typical Quad X. Now before we mount our power distribution board, this particular build is going to be using the mullet flight control. So what we want to do, take the hardware that we have for the flight control, which is the nylon screws, and we're going to install these upwards through these elongated holes in the center of the power distribution board. So we put one nylon nut on each of these screws. just snug those down kind of finger tight. We may need to slide these screws in or out to make our flight control fit. Your flight control should sit right down on top of these screws fairly easily. You shouldn't have to force it. If you feel like you're having to put too much pressure, you can adjust these screws accordingly. Now, let's talk just for a second about motor rotation on this particular VTail build. On your typical Quad X, typically your props rotate inward. So they rotate, this being the front, they would rotate inwards toward the craft. And on the rear, kind of the same thing, they would rotate inwards towards the center of the craft. However, since this is a VTail build, the motor orientation is actually going to be opposite of that of a Quad X. So regardless as to what base flight says, it shows you in the picture as far as your motor rotation, ours is going to rotate opposite. So this motor right here is going to rotate in the counterclockwise direction, opposite of a Quad X. This one is going to rotate in a clockwise direction, which is again opposite of a Quad X. So all four motors are going to spin opposite of what we're used to with a Quad X configuration. So when we solder these wires up to the ESC, we're going to have these wires are going to be soldered straight. No wires will be crossed. This top left motor, all three wires will be soldered straight onto the ESC, which is going to give us the counterclockwise rotation that we need. This motor will have two of the wires crossed going to the ESC, which is going to give us the clockwise rotation that we need. The two rear motors we're going to install using the bullet connectors, and the reason that we're using the bullet connectors is because typically on our builds, let me open up an ESC here. Typically on our builds, what we've done is removed the heat shrink, desoldered these three wires, and that's what we're going to be doing for the front motors, and soldering the motor wires directly to the ESC. On the rear motor, we need that extra wire, so we're going to utilize this. So what we're going to do is install the bullet connectors onto here. That's going to give us that extra wire that we need to mount our ESCs. So motor rotation, we want to get right, but if we get the rear wrong, since we're using the bullet connectors, we can easily go back and correct those. Now I'm going to be mounting my ESCs under the arms. So the signal wire and the power wires are going to come up through this oval shaped hole, and then they're going to mount to the power distribution board. You don't have to do that, that's just what I'm going to do. You can certainly mount your ESC on top of the arm and go straight to your power distribution board. So really, before we go any further, we're actually going to tin some of these connections that we're going to be using for our ESCs. Now for our rear ESCs, I'm going to be using these four pads right here on the rear of the power distribution board. For the front ESCs, I'm going to be using these two pads right here. Then of course we need to connect our battery wire, and we can use any of these that you want to use for your battery connection. So I'm going to go ahead and tin these up and get ready for ESCs. Okay, had a little issue with the camera there, but what I was showing that didn't actually get recorded was I tinned these connections that I'm going to use to mount both the front and the rear ESCs. Now it really doesn't matter which connection you use. I chose these four rear connections and then these two here on each side. And I've snipped the bullet connectors right behind the rear of the bullet connector. You don't want to cut way back here on the wire, you just want to snip it right behind there. And then I've tinned each one of these wires about 1/8 of an inch, just in preparation for connecting those to the ESC. So I need to do the same thing on this ESC, and I'm just going to use my fingers and I'm just going to pull off about 1/8 of an inch. It really doesn't take much at all to get a good good connection there, and then 10 each one of these motor wires. So now we're ready to actually temporarily mount both front ESCs and get those soldered up. The next thing that we're going to do is remove this clear heat shrink tubing from 2 of the ESCs, not all 4 this time, but we're going to remove this from 2 of the ESCs. Take off our heat sink. We're going to desolder these 3 wires, and we're going to be soldering the motor wires directly to the ESC. So to desolder these wires somewhat quickly and effectively, I'm just going to add a little bit of solder to the soldering iron. I know it sounds counterintuitive to add solder when you're getting ready to take something off, but it helps heat it up a whole lot faster. So we've got that solder on there. Once it starts to melt, just go ahead and grab the wire, put a little tension on it. And it'll pop right off. It does take quite a bit of heat actually to get these factory wires desoldered. You want to be careful. You don't want to get it too hot. We're going to do that for both ESCs for the front. Now, since we're mounting this ESC under the arm, just to kind of hold everything together while we mount our ESC, what I would do is just take just a regular old clamp and just clamp your ESC right under the arm, right like that. So I'm going to fish all these wires through this oval shaped hole. Now if we need to move this ESC towards the power distribution board or back, obviously we can do that. But this looks like this is going to work pretty good. So I'm going to route my wires around the back side of the arm, right like this, around, and then they're going to be connected rather, to the ESC, right like this. Now, before we do that, keeping in mind our motor rotation, this is opposite of a quad X, so instead of this one turning in the clockwise direction, this arm here is actually going to turn in the counterclockwise direction. And for counterclockwise direction, we're going to want these soldered straight to the ESC with none of the wires crossed. So if we just fold these over and solder them to the ESC directly like this, we're going to be good. Before we do that, you want to take the heat shrink tubing that Chris has provided, slide that over the ESC. So basically what we're going to have is this right here. This is kind of upside down and backwards for you to be able to see clearly. Let me zoom in a little bit. going to tin each one of these pads because I've removed the solder that was on there from the factory. I'm using the solder that Chris has provided, which I think is much better solder. So I'll show you how to do this kind of quick and kind of easy. First of all, looks like I've got just a little bit too much wire poking through on that one, so I'm just going to trim off about 1/16 of an inch. But what you want to do, remember we've already tinned these. So with these already tinned, and actually I'm going to start with this rear one right here so I'm not working over top of myself. But if we just heat up our pad, slide this right into there with it still hot and lift up. There we go, we have a perfect connection. So we're going to do that for this second one. Heat it up, slide it in, lift up. Same thing. Heat it up till it's nice and flowing. And there we go. We have 3 perfect connections for our ESC. Now, double check, triple check. Make sure that these are in fact soldered straight, how we need them for our motor rotation, which is going to be the counterclockwise direction. Now that we have that, we need to replace our heat sink. So just slide it up. Pull the heat shrink back. Just kind of center the heat shrink on the ESC. That's pretty good right about there. We can actually go ahead and shrink this down now that we know that our motor rotation and everything's going to be correct. You don't have to. You know, better safe than sorry. So you could leave that last if you wanted after we've already tested everything. The difference on this side, 2 of the wires are going to be crossed. Kind of working backwards here. So this wire, which is the other outermost wire, is going to go to the middle. And then the middle wire is going to go to the end. And there we go. All we need to do on here, replace our heat sink, shrink the heat shrink up, tidy up these wires, and then we're going to solder to our power distribution board. So now we have the 2 front ESCs soldered to the motors, and I've soldered 2 of the power wires to the power distribution board here. But before I go any further and solder these other 2, what we want to do on the mullet, the motor connections are actually on the front of the flight control. So what we want to do is we want to get all of these ESC signal wires out here to the front, and these are going to run underneath of the distribution board. So we want to go ahead and just temporarily mount these 2 rear ESCs, which are going to be mounted to the frame right about like this. So we're just going to temporarily mount these back here so that we can run these signal wires underneath of the distribution board. And then we're going to solder these down, because basically once we solder this ESC right here, that's going to kind of clamp that board down to the point where we can no longer lift it up off of here. So what we're going to do now, instead of actually mounting these temporarily, we're going to go ahead and install these bullet connectors. After we install the bullet connectors, then we're going to temporarily mount the ESCs. Things are going to start to move pretty quick. So what we're going to be doing is installing these bullet connectors onto the ends of these wires right here. So I'm just going to show you a really quick and easy way for me when I need to work with small stuff like this. I don't want to damage it. I'm just going to take a pair of pliers, Leatherman, okay, just get a hold of it, and then I'm just going to take a rubber band and put over the back side of my Leatherman. This rubber band is not going to apply near enough force to squish this, so I'm going to use that as my clamp to hold it. So I'm going to get this good and hot, basically fill the inside of this bullet connector with solder. So I have it full to the point where it's bubbling over right there. Now it doesn't matter which one we start with, so I'm just going to pick a wire. Looks like the ends of these wires may already be tinned, but I'm going to hit them again. So I'm just going to heat the end of the wire up and tin it. Now all we need to do is reheat this bullet connector and basically just dip this wire right down into there, right like that. Don't move because it's pretty hot. You don't want to move that wire until that solder has cooled down enough. So there's one bullet connector installed. I'm going to do that for the other two. Now for the rear ESCs, what we're going to do is we're going to mount one on top, and our wires are just going to run straight back here to the power distribution board. And we're going to mount one on the bottom. Those wires are going to come up through this oval shaped hole. Signal wire is going to run under the power distribution board, and then of course our power wire is going to be soldered right here. So I'm going to go ahead and temporarily mount these rear ESCs. We're going to take the two motor wires, run these up underneath the power distribution board, I'm going to lay them flat. I'm just going to stick a standoff on each corner just to kind of hold everything down for right now. So we have all of our signal wires coming out of the front. We're going to need to know obviously which one goes to which ESC, but we're going to worry more about that here in just a few minutes. But for now, we need to go ahead and solder the power wires for the two rear ESCs and then this one remaining front ESC. Now one thing you definitely need to be cautious of is where these wires are routed right here, the signal wires, under this power distribution board, because as we solder these connections, we can easily melt right through the insulation on these wires. So when I'm soldering this set of pads right here, I'm just going to take something like this and I'm going to slide this signal wire out of the way. Then when I solder these pads, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to kind of grab it and I'm going to slide it out of the way so that I'm not heating these up and actually melting through this insulation. I've gone ahead and soldered the two wires that I'm going to use for my battery lead. Haven't put in the XT60 connector yet, but I've just soldered those up. It's a good idea after you do any soldering to just go back with some alcohol and just clean up all of your solder connections. Just clean that rosin and flux and anything else off your board. Also, sometimes you'll get some little balls of solder just kind of floating around, so we want to make sure we've got those cleaned off. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and install an extra nut right here on top of each one of these nuts that's already on here, just to raise our flight control up a little bit. since I chose to use these inside pads. Now before we mount the flight control, we obviously need to install the header pins. Chris gives you both different kinds of headers, whether you want to use the straight header or the right angle. I'm going to be using the right angle. These headers can be somewhat tricky to install, so if you're not experienced at soldering, I definitely recommend practicing on something else before you start on your mullet flight control. But at any rate, when you get done, this is what you should have. Now that the flight controller is mounted, we can go ahead and connect the motor signal wires. The motor connections for a VTail are the exact same as they would be for a Quad X. So this motor is motor 1, motor 2, motor 3, and motor 4. They're going to connect to the mullet from right to left, with this one being motor 1, motor 2, 3, and 4. If you install your header the same way I did, you're going to have your white wire, which is the signal wire, that's going to be facing up. With the rear motors being inverted, it can be somewhat confusing, but I'm going to make it very simple. As we said before, all of the motors are going to be spinning opposite that of a Quad X. So typically, you would have your motors spinning inwards on a Quad X. We've already taken care of the front. Now we need to deal with the rear. On the rear, all of our motor directions are based on looking from the top down. So on the rear, instead of our motors spinning inward like this, they're actually going to spin opposite, which is like this. But since our motors are on the bottom of the arms, the two rear motors are actually going to spin in the exact same direction as they would for a Quad X. So on a Quad X, your bottom right motor is spinning clockwise, your bottom left motor is spinning counterclockwise. That's going to actually be the exact same because the motors are inverted. So that's going to give us the opposite direction that we need for our props. Now, our props on the VTail are going to be installed upside down. To know which prop goes where on the VTail, you would take, for example, just any prop. This particular prop would go on the top right motor of a Quad X. Now, this prop also goes on the rear right motor installed upside down. I've put a piece of paper over that picture that I had back there. I thought that would make a neat backdrop, but I apologize. It turned out to be much more distracting. On the right rear motor, that's going to need to spin in the clockwise direction. You're going to want to cross two of these wires. You're going to have the correct motor direction. On the left rear motor, these are going to be connected straight. So no wires crossed on this motor. That's going to give you counterclockwise direction. And again, the prop that you would use on the rear would be the same prop that you would typically use on a Quad X. On the left front, you're going to take the same prop. It's going to be installed upside down on the left rear. Chris has provided heat shrink tubing that we need for these bullet connections. So you're just going to want to slide this over your wire before you make your connection. Completely cover the bullet connector. Do that for all 6 connectors. He's also given us 5 zip ties. That's attention to detail. We're going to need 1 zip tie here, 1 zip tie here for the 2 front arms. We're going to need 1 zip tie here. That's going to secure both of the ESCs for the rear. Then we're going to be putting 1 zip tie right here and 1 zip tie right here. That's going to keep our wires from moving. That's going to keep everything buttoned up neat. All we really need to do at this point is install our XT60 battery connector, install the prop adapters, install the props, and go into base flight or clean flight, whichever you're going to be using, and calibrate the ESCs. Chris is in the process right now of making a changeover from base flight to clean flight. So I'm not really sure where you're at, what you're going to have. Basically calibrating the ESCs and your basic adjustments and everything are the same between base flight and clean flight. Clean flight does offer some other options, base flight does not. I have installed the zip ties onto the ESCs, connected all the bullet connectors, making sure that the motors are going to spin in the correct direction. I've soldered on the battery connector, and I've installed the prop adapters. You definitely want to put a little drop of Loctite on all the screws on your prop adapters. The only thing we have left is to install the spacers, mount onto the power distribution board, and install our top plate. The whole purpose of these videos is so that anybody that buys the DIY kit should basically be able to go through the entire kit without really having any questions. I hope that I've covered any questions that anyone may have. As far as the flight controller and receiver connections go, the flight controller ships from Chris pre-programmed. So basically that's going to be plug and play. Chris is now going to be using, I think from this point forward, all of the flight controls are going to ship with the clean flight firmware rather than base flight. And as far as the receivers go, there's just entirely too many receivers out there for me to be able to go over any kind of receiver connections or anything like that. I use FreeSky. If there's ever any questions about FreeSky, I may be able to help you there. And there's plenty of other videos that actually cover the naze / mullet type flight controls. So I feel like me going into detail with the flight control is not really necessary. I'm kind of focused on the build, making sure that nobody has any questions on actually building the model. This prop right here, I don't know if you can see that, see the angle of that. You can pull this one over here just so we can compare the two. This prop is going to be installed on the bottom right, upside down. So typically, you know, over here we're installing the prop with our little spacer adapter, you know, to the bottom. But on the VTail with the motors inverted, we're actually installing it with this black adapter facing the bottom of the quad. It's facing the nut. So it's going to install right here like this.